All right, welcome back to Undercurrents from Unheard, where we explore the news and ideas that matter beneath the surface. Please, of course, remember to subscribe to this channel wherever you get your podcasts and over at undercurrents.tv for the premium experience. Today, we have a big show. We'll cover the resignation of Columbia University's president, RFK Jr.'s bid to work for Kamala Harris, and we'll talk about some new immigration numbers coming out of the United States in the context of what's actually happening in the UK right now as well. James Billow will join us for a deep dive into new details about the Nord Stream pipeline. You're not going to want to miss that. I'll dive into Trump's newly complicated relationship with big labor, and Dr. Richard Bosshardt will share his perspective on the American Society of Plastic Surgeons' decision to, as he put it, pump the brakes on gender surgeries for minors just in the last couple of days. So it's a big show. That interview in particular is fascinating because Dr. Bosshardt is a member of the ASPS, the group that I just mentioned, that came out with some caution, words of caution about those surgeries just this week. But let's start with the first of two big stories that developed last night. The president of Columbia University, Manoush Shafik, resigned from office just last night. My friend Eliana Johnson over at the Washington Free Beacon broke that story last night after Shafik emailed members of the Columbia community to say, quote, "I write with sadness to tell you that I am stepping down as president of Columbia University effective August 14th, 2024. So obviously August 14th was yesterday. She notified them basically of an immediate resignation. Now, Shafik did not pretend her resignation was unrelated to campus protests surrounding Gaza. I thought that was interesting because sometimes you see people speak in very vague terms about why they're leaving a position. That's not what happened. In her email, she described recent months as, quote, a period of turmoil where it has been difficult to overcome divergent views across our community. Here's more from that email. This period, she wrote, has taken a considerable toll on my family as it has for others in our community. Over the summer, I have been able to reflect and have decided that my moving on at this point would best enable Columbia to traverse the challenges ahead. I am making this announcement now so that leadership can be in place before the new term begins. Now, I checked yesterday. Columbia goes back to school later than some other colleges. They're back in early September. I feel like at other schools you'd be scrambling because it would happen like right now as students are going back to campus. Now, Shafik lasted for 13 months. 13 months. She succeeded a president that was at Columbia University for years, so it was kind of a big deal that Columbia had handed power off to Shafik. They also liked that Shafik had international experience that came from places like the World Bank and the IMF, and that was seen as a positive thing in terms of Shafik's ability to navigate international challenges and conflicts and all of that. Think about this. All three presidents who were grilled in that anti-Semitism on campus hearing in the House of Representatives after October 7th, specifically, memorably by Elise Stefanik, have now left their jobs. That includes Claudine Gay, who was also absolutely lauded as this splashy new president of Harvard who was going to make a big difference and was suddenly, after some number of months, she didn't even last a year, she was gone from the position over all of this. It's also worth remembering at Columbia, they did happen to have, I shouldn't say happen because that makes it sound like it's nobody's fault. The incidents at Columbia, as much as I believe the American right overstated some of the anti-Semitism in a really helpful way, broadly expanding that definition in the same way that the left has done with other definitions, bigotry, sexism, et cetera, to simply include people who are anti-Zionist. I understand some people intentionally conflate those two to get away with anti-Semitism, but at Columbia, all that said, at Columbia, there was some pretty serious stuff happening. There was one student who a lot of people will remember said, quote, Zionists don't deserve to live. Their future with the university is uncertain as of recent reporting. People may remember there was a video of one person on campus holding a sign. This is back when the protests erupted in the spring that said Al-Qassam's next target. These are obvious, serious acts of anti-Semitism, but the left was also really unhappy with Shafik. So in the same way the right said, you're not doing enough, The Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, last night took a victory lap when Shafiq resigned, because Mike Johnson, people probably remember, went to Columbia when all of this erupted in the spring. The Speaker of the House got involved in the Columbia University president controversy. I mean, that's how high up this went. And he took a victory lap last night. So the right had always been saying Shafiq did not do enough, did not do enough. The left called what Shafiq orchestrated, quote, a crackdown on the students. Now, when I talked to students last spring, they said a lot of those incidents of legitimate anti-Semitism. I talked to one student, actually a Jewish organizer of the protest, who was camping in a tent on the quad at Columbia University. They claim that the woman who was holding that Al-Qassam's next target sign was not actually a Columbia University student. And there were some incidents where you had outside agitators coming in to various different campuses, Columbia included, and their acts being lumped in with acts of students. But clearly, as the president of the university, someone in charge of the physical campus space, Jewish students at Columbia University had some reason to be disturbed by what they were seeing. Now, the crackdown allegations that Shafiq, got all these students off the quad and, called the NYPD, that's where the left was also really unhappy. This is of pro-Palestine demonstrators celebrating the resignation of Shafiq as well. So Axios reports this resignation comes after 3 other Columbia administrators resigned earlier this month for engaging in text that, quote, touched on ancient anti-Semitic tropes, as Shafiq herself had previously put it. This entire news cycle, I think we should absolutely expect to start once again as students are actually back at campus in the fall, which is happening in some schools that go back earlier right now. It's not going anywhere. So the Shafiqs of the world, the Claudine Gays of the world, they need to be prepared, because this is a presidential election cycle, obviously an extremely contentious presidential election cycle. And there's basically nobody in academia outside of maybe the University of Chicago and great schools like Hillsdale that are prepared, that have the ability. I actually thought Ben Sasse did a pretty good job down in Florida of saying there's plenty of room for disagreement. Just don't break the university's rules. And that was always my thought about what the left called a quote, crackdown at Columbia University. I mean, I see what the right was doing as, in some cases, wildly overstating and conflating anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism in a way that was politically correct and not helpful to the free exchange and free flow of ideas. It's not helpful to smear decent people, like the Jewish student that I talked to last spring who organized the protest, was one of the organizers of the protest, had Seder in her tent on the quad. I don't think it's helpful to smear her as an anti-Semite or somebody complicit in anti-Semitism. She should be able to express her opinions about Israel as a Jew, even if that's something that is considered really dangerous by others who are big supporters of Israel, in the same way that those supporters of Israel should be able to do what they do without being called genocidal maniacs. This seems so basic and so obvious, and the debate is fun and fascinating over political correctness on college campuses, and it has been for years, but nobody in this media environment is prepared to really have that conversation and is prepared to really lead a university in a way that, I'm going to use the word again, projects leadership and says this is what young kids deserve. This is what it means to learn on an American campus. There's none of it. There's none of it. So, I mean, again, I would point to Ben Sasse. I think the University of Chicago has done a good job. But these are Ivy League universities. They were the jewel of global academics, and they cannot make it through these news cycles. The presidents can't make it through these news cycles with projecting a sense of strength and confidence. Maybe that's what's lacking. It's moral clarity. The moral clarity is that you're allowed to say awful things and have a debate. And in fact, we're all better for allowing people with awful ideas to have that debate. It's really not that hard. It wasn't that hard in this country for a really long time. It wasn't that hard in the West for a really long time, but apparently it is now. I think moral clarity is what, when I talk to students in college, it's the one thing that they feel like they're missing. So let's find some maybe Ivy League presidents with moral clarity. All right, let's turn now to news that broke last night as well about Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who the Washington Post reports sought to convince Kamala Harris she should promise him a cabinet job if he agrees to drop out of the race. Now, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. texted the New York Times on Wednesday night to say, quote, "We've reached out repeatedly through the highest level intermediaries. We have been told they have no interest in talking with me." According to the Washington Post, again, the Kennedy campaign has produced polling which it has tried to share with Democrats that it claims shows both Harris and Trump would get a boost in their public support across 31 states if either candidate announced publicly that Kennedy would have a cabinet role in their administration. Looking at the numbers for RFK Jr., his support did drop significantly after Biden got out of the race. According to the 538 average, he's down to about 5.5%. That was hovering closer to the 10% range if you were looking at polling. I mean, some polls just in the last 6 months or so had him near like 17%. Those were mostly outliers, but you were finding polls that had him consistently around 15% of support. I don't think, though, it's appropriate in any way to dismiss the seriousness of what Kennedy is saying here, because Hillary Clinton learned in 2016 that a third-party candidate, even getting 5% of support in battleground states, can make or break your candidacy. If you did the math in Pennsylvania, as Hillary Clinton definitely did the math in Pennsylvania back in November of 2016, you found that if a significant percentage of people who chose to vote for Jill Stein instead cast their ballots for Hillary Clinton, that she would have probably won the Electoral College and been president of the United States. And you have to do the math in different battleground states to get those numbers, but it's a pretty legitimate argument. One of the big questions is whether those people who voted for Jill Stein would have stayed home or voted for Hillary Clinton. It doesn't have to be every voter, though, for a third-party candidate. You just need a chunk of those people who are going to vote for Bobby Kennedy to say, all right, it makes more sense for me to support one candidate or the other. And Kennedy is now using his leverage, or trying to use his leverage, to convince one of the campaigns to give him a cabinet post. He's talked to Trump about perhaps overseeing questions of health. I could see him perhaps convincing Kamala Harris to put him in charge of maybe environmental things. I doubt you'd see an EPA administrator, Bobby Kennedy, but I actually doubt you'll see Bobby Kennedy in a Kamala Harris cabinet, period, because they're not even talking to him. He actually, you may remember, before the RNC, had a conversation with Donald Trump. Donald Trump at least talked to Bobby Kennedy, but if any of the candidates is more likely to tap Kennedy for a cabinet position, I think it's probably Trump. I do, though, think there's a measure of overconfidence coming from the Harris campaign here, because what happened with Jill Stein could happen times two in a place like Pennsylvania. They have, and maybe Kennedy honestly reached out too early, because I do think Kamala Harris's momentum is going to stall. I think, obviously we talk about this here. This is going to be a close race no matter what. I think the numbers will start to shift back a little bit, but she's up in some battleground states right now. We're going to talk about that in the next segment. But, those numbers are scary for the Trump campaign. I don't think she's going to keep that trajectory. That upward trajectory is going to keep happening. Maybe it'll plateau. Maybe it'll go back a little bit. Harry Enton had, CNN's kind of polling guru, had an excellent dose of caution for Democrats right now, that if the polling errors are similar to 2016 and 2020, the race is basically tied in those battleground states. She's not even up. So that's I think, important caveat to all of this, or important layer of nuance to all of this. But that overconfidence from the Harris campaign, I mean, dismissing him, not responding to apparently any of this polling, or how did he put it, they've reached out repeatedly through the highest level intermediaries and been told they have no interest in talking with me. I don't think that's going to change, even if her numbers slow down. It'll be interesting to see if it does, because honestly, it would probably be a good olive branch to anti-establishment Democrats who at the DNC next week are going to be very, very unhappy with Kamala Harris, meaning there are going to be protesters who get a lot of news. At least we're expecting that. The protests are planned as of right now for Monday and Thursday. I'll be there. We'll be there covering it for Undercurrents, of course. But that's going to put front and center the level of distrust towards the DNC, towards the establishment Democratic Party. And as that happens, as the honeymoon period with the media starts to wane, we've already seen that happening to some extent. We've seen, for example, I think it was Jim Acosta yesterday ribbing the campaign for not doing enough interviews. Meanwhile, you have like establishment figures like Michael McFaul saying if Kamala Harris does interviews, it hurts her chances of winning the presidency. Therefore, she should do no interviews. This coming from people who claim they're supporting Kamala Harris for the sake of lowercase d democracy. This is going to be a lot tougher. This energy is going to be a lot tougher for Kamala Harris to sustain going forward. So, I mean, they would be wise to take the Kennedy threat much more seriously than they are, because already a chunk of Kennedy voters have gone to Harris. So we've seen that in the polling. There were a lot of people who just wanted to support, a lifetime Democrat who was sentient. They didn't want to vote for Joe Biden. She's doing well with the, quote, double haters. So there may be more ground that she can make to really cement Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan to make up those marginal differences that make or break you in the Electoral College. So she would be wise to take this seriously. I don't think they will, though, because they can't bring themselves. It's like the deplorable comment, right? If you can't bring yourself to take seriously people who might support Bobby Kennedy Jr. as your voters, if you don't want them, you're not going to get them. And you're going to need some of them, in all likelihood, to make up those margins. Or you would be wise to get some of them to at least try to make up some of those margins in battleground states. Honeymoon's not going to last forever. In fact, I don't even know that it's going to last another few weeks, let alone the 2 months that it needs to for Kamala Harris to feel really good about what's going to happen on November 5th. Let's turn now to immigration. The New York Times had a actually very useful analysis of recent immigration numbers that was published just yesterday. At under 5 months, they reported application processing speed, this is for asylum, is now on par with 2013 and 2014. About 3.3 million immigrants have become citizens during President Biden's time in office, with less than 2 months to go before the close of the 2024 fiscal year. The U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services took 4.9 months on average to process naturalization applications in the first 9 months of the current fiscal year, compared with 11.5 months in fiscal 2021. So that's, again, just to get this 30,000 foot, that's more applications being processed and in less time. So those 2 points are really important ones, and just about everybody has called for faster asylum processing times. You can see in this next chart how dramatically asylum claims in the United States have increased over the course of the Biden administration. They actually did start to go up a bit during the Trump administration, and if you go back even before the Obama administration, there's some increases there as well. Dips really heavily around COVID and then spikes. I mean, we're talking, if you're looking at this chart right now, doubling basically of asylum applications being filed, which is a hugely significant component that the media often gets really wrong of why you have a massive immigration surge in the United States under Biden. And then if we take a look at the next chart, you see these asylum cases are going undecided at a rate that basically matches up with the increase in the asylum applications being filed. Now, that's really important because it means the system is being totally overwhelmed. Now, if the system is being totally overwhelmed, and you'll see, by the way, on this chart, sometimes we'll say, well, asylum applications are being denied at a higher rate. And that's true. They are being denied at a higher rate under Biden. They were also being denied at a higher rate under Trump. And it's because you have, or more of them are being denied. That's because you have this influx in applications in the first place, which is, again, a really important piece of context to that. Same thing with deportations going up and applications being temporarily closed, as this Vox chart puts it, or granted, right? You're going to have more of those numbers when you have more migrants, period. So basically everybody agrees that you need to have more and more people being processed when you have more and more people making asylum claims. But where people are going to disagree, very obviously, is on whether those asylum claims should be accepted. Because I've been to the border and I've talked to plenty of people making asylum claims who don't have legitimate asylum claims. The last time I was down at the border, I was talking to migrants, the people that I talked to, again, in just the half an hour of me getting to know them, had very good reasons for fleeing their country, wanting to support their families, wanting to lift themselves up out of poverty, in some cases just wanting to lift themselves up out of the lower middle class. they did not, in almost every case, have a legitimate asylum claim, and were fleeing basically economic conditions. There were a lot of economic migrants. There were some people who just, I could talk about this all day because it's so different from the media narrative. We talk to people who, they have these awful brushes with violence from the cartels who they're paying to shepherd them up across the border. A ticket is a subsidy to a cartel. Nobody crosses. This is what one facilitator or let's say a worker in one of these shelters told us. Nobody crosses without paying the cartels. That's a direct quote, and it's absolutely true when you talk to migrants. They don't cross without paying the cartels, and they get coached on making asylum claims, even if they don't have legitimate asylum claims. So the economic migrants put themselves in extremely physically risky, dangerous situations in order to make false asylum claims. That's sort of the pipeline here. And what's really sad to me about looking at this chart about these increased asylum claims is also when you look at how none of them are being adjudicated. And that puts us in a situation where I want to put this Unheard article up on the screen. Liberals should not be complacent about the meaning of Englishness. It's such an interesting take. The article concludes, the claims of the intellectual right to a white Englishness as something to venerate and, quote, return to has little broad resonance, but it, with ideas of white Britishness, has an appeal to some who feel marginalized. A race-based English-British identity allows them to make a distinct claim to belong in a rapidly changing and increasingly diverse world. For some, it becomes a justification for racist violence. This is obviously in the context of the civil unrest that is absolutely gripping the UK right now in the wake of what happened in Southport. And what does that have to do with these asylum claims not being adjudicated? Well, I actually think it has a lot to do with the asylum claims not being adjudicated, because when you bring in literally millions of people who don't have citizenship, who don't have let's even borrow the phrase, a path to citizenship, who aren't invested in the sort of American project, which is very different than the British/English project, as this particular article puts it, because it's really never been based on race or ethnicity. It's never been as, I would say, homogenous. We like to talk about how America is an idea. Well, yeah, I mean, America is a country with borders, but America also has been in a very literal sense, a melting pot. It's just baked into the American identity. It's something that Americans are very proud of, and that's why there is a lot of favorability towards immigration, towards helping asylum seekers here in the United States. And there is, to some extent throughout the West, but in the United States, this generosity of spirit, and by the way, we have a declining birth rate. There's a pretty good argument that we could use, more people coming in, and especially, frankly, more religious people coming in who will have lots of children and become parts of their communities, et cetera, et cetera. But when you're only an asylum claimee, when you're just somebody who is waiting to become a citizen, it's really, really hard to integrate massive levels of that with the American population. It has absolutely nothing to do with race or ethnicity. It has everything to do with being invested in the country as a citizen, a voting citizen. Doesn't mean you give the vote to people who don't have that investment in the country, but it's a very, very, very different thing to be an American citizen or to be somebody who is temporarily living in America, unsure of whether you will permanently be in America or not. And one thing that the left just fundamentally has a hard time with is that the more generous your immigration policies are, the more people would prefer to live in the shadows of American society than to live in the shadows of Venezuelan society, or, for example, Honduran society, Guatemalan society, because honestly, you can make more money and have a higher standard of living, and in some cases be with family who had already left years before. So that cost-benefit analysis for economic migrants, if you make it a system where you can, have sanctuary cities, people can make asylum claims, and then kind of live off the grid, because in those sanctuary cities, you're not going to get deported. It's the cost-benefit analysis for them is take this economic migration journey, come to the United States, and live in a sanctuary city, or hope that your asylum claim gets processed. So all that is to say, we now just over the course of the Biden administration, when you look at the immigration numbers, it was an astounding increase. And I've talked to a lot of these people, and their stories are amazing. They're brave. They want to support their families. They're now being integrated, or we're attempting to integrate them into communities all over the country in massive numbers. And they're not fully integrated as part of the American project as citizens. And you can't just make everybody citizens. You can't just create this easy pathway to citizenship, because then literally everybody will come and overwhelm you with fake asylum claims or dubious asylum claims. So all that is to say, I think we're underestimating how seriously this problem has escalated just over the course of the last couple of years. And that's sort of depressing, but I think it's really true. So, I would expect to see, sadly, more unrest along these lines here in the United States in the years to come. But hopefully there's a way to stop the pattern and to deal justly and morally with the millions of people from around the world who do want to come here and have better lives. We'll be back with more Undercurrents right after this. Well, we're joined now by Unheard Newsroom editor James Billow for our daily deep dive. James, the Nord Stream pipeline is at the center of the conflict in Eastern Europe and has been at the center actually for a number of years. People might remember conversations about Nord Stream pipelines predating Putin's invasion of Ukraine to begin with, and now developments warrant this deep dive. Tell us what we learned about the blowing up of the Nord Stream pipeline, another very consequential moment in this conflict just in the last couple of days.
Deep dive is a particularly fitting description of this segment today. We had Germany in the last 2 days issue an arrest warrant for a Ukrainian national over the 2022 attacks on the Nord Stream pipelines. The suspect is a Ukrainian diving instructor named only as Vladimir Z for privacy reasons. This person is believed to have left Poland. His whereabouts is currently unknown. But who is behind the Nord Stream attacks has been this long-running mystery for the past 2 years. And so just to give you a quick overview, Nord Stream 1, Nord Stream 2. Nord Stream 2 was a not yet operational pipeline, but they were major conduits from the Baltic Sea of Russian gas into Europe, and that was particularly the case for Germany. Germany used this as a valuable source of gas. Their use was controversial because the EU was reliant on Russian energy, and it was feared that it would become some kind of economic leverage for Putin. So this attack occurred on September 2022, and blame was cast immediately in two major directions. On the one side, we had the neoconservatives, the liberal internationalists, or as some people like to call them, the NATO shills, and they all said it was clearly Russia. So let me just run you through a few of these headlines just to give you a flavor. Politico said, everything pointing to Russia. Washington Post editorial board, the author of this strike against Europe's stability and security was Russia. An Atlantic Council writer, everything is pointing to Russia being behind this. David Goldwyn, a State Department official under Obama, said it was unequivocal that Russia was behind this attack. And then even a year later, we had countries like Germany's defense minister suggesting that it was some kind of Russian false flag to smear Ukraine. The idea that Russia would be behind the destruction of its own pipeline and essentially kneecapping its own bit of leverage over the continent of Europe, it never really made that much sense.
Yes, no, I think that's a point that's worth pausing on, because actually the question of sanctions, Biden's decisions as it related to sanctions on the pipeline, a lot of people will point back to that and say this is where Putin decided that it made sense to actually invade Ukraine, that was kind of at the center of his decision making in terms of the timing. Was he always going to do it? Open question. But under Joe Biden, did he do it because of Nord Stream sanctions and Biden's decision there? Hugely, hugely important question. So then the motive, it's the exact same question there. And it seems like what was generated, those headlines you ran down, again, just worth internalizing. Washington Post editorial board, Politico, U.S. Energy Secretary. These were, you have the State Department official under Obama saying, quote, unequivocal, using the word unequivocal, which gave permission to all of these news outlets to have essentially a fake news cycle. And I hate using that term, but this is insane. Like in the hours after the attack, you were called a conspiracy theorist if you suggested some force other than Russia, if you suggested we didn't know whether Russia was behind it. You were smeared as a conspiracy theorist. And just revisiting those headlines, James, I think is a worthy exercise, because I don't know that a lot of, typical Americans have spent the last couple of years musing over who actually attacked the Nord Stream pipeline. But it's another notch in the distrust scoreboard for media, and this is a significant one.
Right, and the thing to emphasize about that is that this was very much a bipartisan reaction. Had neoconservatives all the way down to Lindsey Graham, of course, we spoke about him in the last item, Marco Rubio, all the way through to Obama state officials. So it really became a bipartisan belief that Russia must have been behind this. But on the other side, we had another camp that was let's say the leftists, the realists, those who are a little bit more skeptical about America. And they were certain, in much the same way that these other people were certain that Russia was behind it, they were certain America was behind it. And in fairness, there was a lot of circumstantial evidence pointing in their favor. So for instance, they picked up on these remarks from Joe Biden.
If Russia invades, that means tanks or troops crossing the border of Ukraine again. Then there will be no longer a Nord Stream 2. We will bring an end to it.
Or this from State Department official Victoria Nuland.
If Russia invades Ukraine, one way or another, Nord Stream 2 will not move forward.
So both these comments alluding to the fact that Nord Stream 2 would come to an end, wasn't really specific about how that would be the case, and that's why it was left to all this interpretation. But then the smoking gun for this camp really came with the tweet from Radoslaw Sikorski, former Poland foreign minister, who tweeted, "Thank you, USA," which was deleted shortly after the explosion.
Husband, of course, of Anne Applebaum, who's a big name in sort of establishment foreign policy circles.
So you can see there was a lot of circumstantial evidence pointing in Americans' favor. And it was fueled even more so by a big Seymour Hersh story, who claimed that the US orchestrated the attack and that Biden had colluded with the Norwegian Navy.
And he was, remind me, Hersh was suggesting the CIA had colluded with the Norwegian Navy.
CIA, he said, was instrumental in this collusion. In the succeeding weeks about this Seymour Hersh story, it went all the way up to the White House, who were forced to deny it. And we had researchers, open source researchers, picking holes in several of the claims made by Hersh. But the fundamental issue with that story was that it relied on a single anonymous source. So whether that was enough for people to ride on, it seemed unlikely, but others insisted that it still must have been America. We had David Sachs here tweeting the following, and then we had another Sachs, Jeffrey, who was actually speaking to Unheard's Freddie Sayers about why America must have been the guilty party.
Frankly, it's been obvious from the start. This was not an easy operation to carry out. It's the kind of operation that the CIA and other covert parts of the U.S. government do carry out rather routinely, by the way. They blow up lots of infrastructure over time, try to keep it hidden. But it was hard to keep this one hidden because the United States was basically the only country with the motive, the means, and rather remarkably, having announced beforehand that the intention was to end Nord Stream if Russia invaded Ukraine.
So for some time, this mystery continued, but signs started pointing to a third party. Now, it wasn't a lone rogue fisherman or something like that. It was actually Ukraine. So although people like Jeffrey Sachs dismissed Ukraine because they said that the country didn't have the means or the resources or even the motive to conduct such an operation, it was entertained by someone else. And this person has come away from this explosion smelling like roses. So here is former presidential advisor Fiona Hill speaking with Freddie again in February 2023. Firstly, here she is explaining why she didn't think it was the US.
If the United States had done that by now, given the way that the United States system works, somebody would have laid claim to this. I mean, you can think about many other episodes in which it's got out. The United States can be a pretty leaky sieve in terms of information.
And here she is explaining why it could have been Ukraine.
Some of my colleagues who have been looking at this think Ukraine could have done it. And, it's not implausible because, they already, managed to have a pretty significant strike on the Kerch Bridge, for example. But I haven't seen any evidence.
And so funnily enough, a month after that interview took place, more evidence seemed to support her claim. And it came out that US officials believed that a pro-Ukraine group was behind the attacks. And now, over a year on from that report, Germany has issued an arrest warrant for a Ukrainian international. However, the story is still unfolding. So yesterday, we had a Wall Street Journal piece detailing exactly how the mission was conducted. The source of controversy was, okay, Ukraine might have been involved, but it certainly didn't go all the way up to Zelensky. Now, according to this Wall Street Journal report, Zelensky was informed and he did give his initial approval. So the Ukrainian operation, it cost around $300,000. It involved a 6-member crew that involved trained civilian divers. Zelensky initially approved the plan, and now here we return to the CIA. He approved it, but when the CIA later learned of the operation, they had demanded or asked President Zelensky to pull the plug, and he subsequently did that. So actually, the CIA did play a role, but it seemed to play the opposite role, if these reports are to be believed, than what the realists and leftists thought.
So, James, I'm looking at this Wall Street Journal story right now, and we're talking about divers renting a yacht, some CIA awareness. It bears an eerie resemblance to the Seymour Hersh story, does it not? I mean, when I'm looking at just the sort of bones of what the Wall Street Journal is reporting now, I mean, Hersh seems to be putting more of the, if my memory is serving me correctly, he seemed to put more of the, I guess, responsibility or driving force behind the CIA, or he ascribes that to the CIA more than maybe this journal story does, but the sort of bones of it seem really similar.
What Hersh gets right is the level of CIA involvement. But if this Wall Street Journal piece is to be believed, it's not that the CIA gave its tacit green light or approval to the operation, it's that it found out via Dutch intelligence about this operation. They forced or pressured Zelensky to call it off.
We know that money is fungible, and we know that the CIA had some awareness, though tried to, it sounds like based on this reporting, was not pleased with the plan. So that's interesting too, because we know that the Ukrainian military can't prosecute this war without funding from NATO allies, without a lot of funding from the United States, but even significant sacrifice and funding from countries like Poland, et cetera. So I guess it's almost, to me, not entirely mutually exclusive with some of the points about U.S. involvement, or not even, it would be wrong to say U.S., more NATO involvement, because Ukraine couldn't have funded all of this, likely. I mean, $300,000, sure, but they're in the middle of a war. They're spending money that is mostly coming from other countries at this point.
And it's not to suggest that this was some kind of rinky-dink operation. In fact, according to that Wall Street Journal report, it wasn't just Ukrainian state-backed, but they actually got in a lot of private business. They called it a private-public partnership to sustain and financially support this operation. But one of the big giveaways about the boat that was setting sail from the Danish port was that it had a small Ukrainian flag, which was sort of beggars belief as far as detective stories go. But to me, there are two big takeaways from this. One, real egg on the face for Germany, which for the past 2.5 years has been sending tens of billions of euros and huge amounts of military machinery to Ukraine, only for that country to respond, if it was Ukraine, that with one of the worst acts of industrial terrorism, essentially kneecapping Germany's energy policy. And quickly after that explosion occurred, you have Germany, France, other European countries nationalizing their energy companies, prices soaring. There was a huge economic fallout. But then on a more human level, I think what this goes to show is just how powerful people's priors are when it comes to these kind of issues. It's not just cultural issues, but it's foreign policy as well. And it just showed how quickly the groupthink cemented in these two positions. Was it America? Was it Russia? Could have been Ukraine. But the idea that it might have been a bit of everything, it just seemed to be completely alien to what a lot of these people seem to believe.
That's an excellent point, because I'm remembering and just sort of trying to put myself in my own shoes back in the swirl of this particular news cycle. And then when Hersh's story came out too, I mean, it was so immediate and so confident from, of course, this chorus of people in legacy media. But then obviously there was a smaller chorus of equally confident and equally rapid sort of reacting people who said, obviously this was the CIA, obviously this was the United States. And now it does appear that the United States had some knowledge of it. And what the United States actually tried to do here is, I think, probably still going to be an open question that's left for plenty of debate. Also, James, my final thought on this is, hell of a Guy Ritchie movie. Like, this needs to be a Guy Ritchie movie. It sounds like Guy Ritchie, like, orchestrated it.
They use military dolphins in this operation. If that's true, then they can't not make this film.
Military dolphins?
Yes. And I went on a bit of a rabbit hole or a dolphin hole in the last hour, finding exactly how this operation used such animals.
You could have just said
that's a story for another day.
You could have said you went on a deep dive, but you said you went on a dolphin hole.
Sorry, it's a terrible choice of words.
James Billow, Unheard Newsroom editor, thank you for this deep dive. I found it very helpful.
Thank you. Bye.
Donald Trump appears to be underperforming in the Rust Belt, of all places, amid Kamala Harris's honeymoon phase. Nick Fuentes, for example, told his audience of groypers that he's demanding Trump fire campaign managers Chris LaCivita and Susie Wiles. Alongside a screenshot of some unfortunate poll results on CNN, Fuentes wrote, quote, "This is what happens when you listen to GOP consultants and cuck out in order to pander to racial minorities and moderates." All right, well, Fuentes has a significant Twitter army, I guess, but is ultimately a weirdo bigot streamer who doesn't move the needle much. The Daily Mail, though, is also reporting that, quote, Trump is reportedly talking to his confidants about firing LaCivita and Wiles. Here on this show, we talked just last week about the conspicuous absence of Steve Bannon, as commenters like Matt Stoller, Glenn Greenwald, and Lee Fang have pointed out. We even talked about how LaCivita and Wiles specifically are an odd fit for the populist Trump campaign, given their backgrounds as establishment operatives in LaCivita's case and lobbyists in Wiles' case. Is that why he sounds different, Trump, this time around? Because he does. For more on that, you should check out last Thursday's episode of Undercurrents, but also now check out the CNN analysis I mentioned earlier. Among non-college educated white voters in the battleground states of Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, Trump was up 25 points on Biden in May, according to a New York Times Siena poll. Against Harris, he is only now up 14 points. As Harry Enton of CNN said, quote, Harris is doing significantly better than Biden among Trump's base of white working-class voters. If she puts up these numbers with them, she'll win. That's what happens when those margins are so close in states like Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, which we remember from 2016 being crucial and being down to tens of thousands of votes. The difference in Trump's messaging from 2016, as discussed earlier, has to be playing a role, of course. Granted, it's true he's arguably facing even tougher odds, having lost in 2020, than being convicted of felonies afterwards and then attacked more and more by the press. I get all that. Yet the most wrinkled I've seen Democrats this entire cycle is actually over Teamsters head Sean O'Brien's speech back at the RNC. Now O'Brien is accusing Trump this week of endorsing, quote, economic terrorism. So what happened? Check out this ad the UAW already cut using Trump's own words to Elon Musk on this week's Spaces meeting.
I mean, I look at what you do. You walk in and you just say, you want to quit? They go on strike. I won't mention the name of the company, but they go on strike and you say, that's okay, you're all gone. You're all gone. So every one of you is gone.
So those are the remarks that prompted O'Brien to say, quote, firing workers for organizing, striking, and exercising their rights as Americans is economic terrorism. O'Brien's remarks at the RNC were huge. They were a landmark in the political realignment. Tim Walz spoke to a huge group of union workers just on Tuesday and kind of ribbed Trump over his lack of working class bona fides. Nothing new for Democrats, but take a listen.
Can you simply picture Donald Trump working at a McDonald's trying to make a McFlurry or something? He knows us. He couldn't run that damn McFlurry machine if it cost him anything, so.
Walz, interestingly enough, invoked Ronald Reagan when he said he was the first person on a presidential ticket since the Gipper who belonged to a union. It's actually not true, because of all people, Donald Trump was a union member until the Screen Actors Guild dropped him on January 6th, or after January 6th. To be honest, though, I'm not sure what Donald Trump said to Musk is really going to hurt him all that much with union voters, union households specifically. After Reagan famously fired striking air traffic controllers, his share of the vote among union households did dip to 46%, although that's still high, and he still retained the endorsement of the Teamsters. Here's a really interesting excerpt from a 1984 Time magazine story on that election. Quote, Reagan's stand tall image also held appeal. When Geraldine Ferraro asked workers in a Belvidere, Illinois Chrysler plant why they planned to vote for Reagan, they said they feared Mondale would reinstate the anemic foreign policy of the Carter administration. Says the retired UAW president Fraser, the macho factor was important. Oh my gosh, that could have been plucked from a story in 2016, straight from a story in 2016. Trump constantly said on the campaign trail back then that he wasn't beholden to special interests or to billionaires. He talked about it all the time. It was a huge part of his appeal. He can't really make that point today. Maybe firing strikers comes across as, quote, macho, actually, and will only hurt with union bosses like O'Brien rather than the rank and file members who care about Trump's America First agenda and like and trust him. But I will say, what looks less macho is losing in 2020, constantly talking about it, and then cozying up to billionaire tech nerds. Stay with me for a fascinating interview with a doctor who's a member of the group of plastic surgeons who made a really big statement when it comes to gender transition surgeries just this week. We're going to break it all down. Stay tuned. I'm very excited to be joined now by Dr. Richard Bosshardt. He is a senior fellow at Do No Harm, and especially for the purposes of this interview, he's also, it's important to say, a member of the American Society of Plastic Surgeons. Dr. Bosshardt, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Now, we can put this headline up on the screen. This is from the Daily Caller. It says, First Major U.S. Medical Association says evidence for child sex change surgeries is, quote, low quality. That quote about low quality was first reported in City Journal in a big story that just came out and said essentially this is the first major fracture in the so-called consensus in the medical establishment that these surgical interventions were in some way necessary or shouldn't be questioned. And actually, even that language opens up a Pandora's box in and of itself. So Dr. Bosshardt, I wanted to ask you if you could talk to us a little bit about the development this week with the ASPS actually telling City Journal that the evidence for this is, quote, the child sex change surgeries is, quote, low quality. What did you make of that decision?
Well, first off, this came as a surprise to me. It's not like I'm privy to the deliberations of the hierarchy of the ASPS. I'm a member of over 30 years, but like most members, my involvement is more in keeping with, paying my dues, supporting the ASPS in various ways. But I'm not, attending their policy meetings and things of that sort. This is definitely a surprise and a delightful one in the sense that this issue of consensus and settled science has been a contentious issue now for, I guess, several years. I think COVID kind of started the ball rolling because of all the disagreements about the management and the virus and so forth. And of course, this issue of gender-affirming care has become very contentious, with people on one side saying that this is a necessary medical intervention to prevent, adolescents and children from committing suicide. The opposite side of the coin says that we are medicalizing people that have a condition that is in large part temporary. So the long and short is that I think that the fact that the ASPS is saying, wait a minute, we need to look at this more closely. We're not going to sign on to this right away. While it's not an actual renunciation, I think this idea of as someone put it, pumping the brakes a little bit, is excellent. And I'm hoping it leads to other medical organizations getting the courage, which I think is what's required to say that we have to have these discussions and debates and not proceed as though it's settled science and there is a consensus on transitioning minors. The issue is really in minors. I don't think there's any real dispute going on about adults that are seeking to transition. Adults can make their own decision, but not children. Children don't have the agency that adults do.
That's a really important point. And I wanted to ask, actually, just as a plastic surgeon, if you could talk to us a little bit about one of the big problems in this entire conversation about sex changes, gender transitions, which is there's a conflation of the surgical versus the medical, and the surgical interventions are obviously that's, to borrow a phrase from Abigail Schreier, irreversible damage in almost every case. City Journal reported on insurance data showing thousands of double mastectomies among young women just in the last couple of years. That's different than what people describe as gender-affirming care, in terms of that could be everything from pronouns to psychiatry or psychology. There's some really significant differences here. And as a plastic surgeon, perhaps you could talk to us about how significant the actual surgical interventions are for gender-affirming care when it's referred to that way.
Well, plastic surgery is the last step. You don't see any surgery being done to transition someone who has not gone through a long process, typically a process of years, of living as the opposite sex and of going through the whole issue of hormonal treatment and so forth. So we're kind of the caboose, but in some respects, I think that we're perhaps the most important part. But you can't separate the two. You can't separate the medical and the surgical, because you can't do one without the other. With respect to the issue of surgery, one of the claims with respect to medical treatment is that you can reverse this. Now, that claim is disputed, and I won't go into that, but it is by no means considered a settled issue that these puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones are completely reversible. But I can tell you from 35 years of experience as a plastic surgeon, surgery is irreversible. Once you lay a knife to a patient, you will do things that can never be totally taken back. And when you're talking about radical, complex operations to construct, genitalia that does not exist naturally in an individual that is not genetically made to have that particular body part, you're talking about significant potential for complications. No way this can be reversed. One of the things that people don't realize is the limitations of what we do. Taking a simple, relatively simple thing is this issue of top surgery. I hate the term. I mean, it's a little cutesy term that basically gets around the fact that you're cutting off normal breasts in young women. But when you do a mastectomy on somebody, or someone presents to you for reconstruction after having had a mastectomy, that is a very difficult reconstruction, and it typically is not going to be a one-step process. It's going to be anywhere from a 2 to 3-step process with potential for complications along the way. And the end result is never going to be a natural result. It's never going to be a breast that would have naturally occurred. You're not going to have the sensitivity, the shape and appearance, and other aspects of the breast are not going to be remotely natural. You're trying to produce a facsimile. And then when you're talking about trying to create an artificial vagina or create an artificial penis, I mean, the complexity shoots up orders of magnitude. I think some people seem to believe that you can learn how to do these things in a week-long or a weekend course and do them, intermittently or infrequently in your practice. I think that this kind of work is something that needs to be done by experts with a lot of experience doing a lot of this. And again, we're talking about minors here. We're not talking about adults. And that issue relates to, in some respects, to the issue, for example, of size. If you're trying to do things with a child-sized penis, for example, you're not going to have the tissue that you have in an adult to work with, and that's going to compromise what you can do. Puberty blockers, by their very nature, are going to stop the process of growth and development of the genitalia, and that's going to complicate surgery dramatically. It's really been discouraging to me that plastic surgery as a specialty has not weighed in more quickly and more extensively in this whole conversation, because we are the experts. This is our bailiwick. We're the ones who know about the complications and the complexity and all that goes into that.
To me, it's so interesting that we are celebrating, I think rightfully so, the ASPS's willingness to give that statement to City Journal, and I think it is a landmark moment, but it seems strange that the ASPS or a group like the ASPS would even have to. and would do it, now that they did have to, years into this conversation, because the name of the group that you're a senior fellow at, as we mentioned earlier, is Do No Harm. I mean, it's a very simple concept. I guess I'm curious, Dr. Bosshardt, what you're hearing from others in the plastic surgery community who maybe now are, maybe this even precipitated the statement from the ASPS this week, are maybe now looking around and saying, this industry moved way too fast.
It's interesting you asked that question, and I'll answer it very simply. I'll give you the short answer, then I'll give you a slightly longer answer. The short answer is that when this came out, I only learned about this late evening before last, because I heard the City Journal article was going to come out, and I was asked to provide a statement by Do No Harm. And I promptly went to the ASPS website, where they have a discussion forum where surgeons can post, questions and have discussions on clinical issues. And I posted about this, and I said, I'm delighted that the ASPS has taken this step. I think it's a wonderful thing. I think that the membership needs to step up and acknowledge the leadership of the ACS and tell them that they are in agreement with this. That was over 24 hours ago. There's not been a single comment on that post since then. And I have been posting this issue of gender affirming care as it relates to plastic surgery for well over 2 years. And the engagement has been very disappointing. It's very hard to get anyone to comment on it and weigh in. I don't think it's necessarily because plastic surgeons are apathetic, nor do I think it's because they all are in agreement with doing these gender-affirming surgeries in minors. I think what's happened in our culture, and this includes medicine, is that nowadays, if you step away or step out publicly and comment on an issue that goes against the so-called consensus, you can be absolutely just demonized, canceled, you'll be censured, you're going to have people coming after you, calling you all sorts of names, you're a transphobe and so forth. I had this experience when I questioned the American College of Surgeons embracing anti-racism and DEI. And as a result of my objections to that, I was permanently banned from any ability to converse with my fellow surgeons through the ACS website. And that ban has now been in place for over 2 years. Now, the ASPS has not done anything like that. I mean, there are definitely contentious conversations on the discussion forum. So I think the ASPS leadership has been much more willing to open up the conversation. But I think that a lot of surgeons don't want to engage. I mean, they don't want to be bothered by all the blowback that they may get if they start getting into these very, very controversial waters. And there's very few things out there right now that are more controversial than gender affirming care in children. You're not going to get anybody with a moderate position that's going to be one or the other.
Although hopefully it's increasingly less controversial, because in the US it remains controversial despite actions that have been taken in other Western countries where it's, I guess, become less of a political football, and actions like this from the ASPS have fueled that sort of lurch towards a more bipartisan or transpartisan, I guess I could say, consensus on that. Absolutely no pun intended there. Dr. Bosshardt, how significant is this in your industry? Because being outside the industry, sometimes things circulate in the media, and the media doesn't know much about inside the industry and thinks it's all really important, and maybe it's not so important. But it strikes me that this is a fairly significant moment because we see so little consensus fracturing on this issue here in the U.S. The elite opinion on it is so strong and so settled that they don't let others question it. And it's been that way for years, but it seems that this is a brave move by the ASPS. It seems that this is the right move by the ASPS. And I just wonder, as a plastic surgeon, is it a big deal? Or is it, maybe journalists like me saying it's a big deal and it's not actually, it won't make a huge difference?
No, not at all. It's a big deal. It's a huge deal. What's interesting in what you said was that, we in the U.S. are looking at the same data. We all have the CAS review. We all have the WPATH files. We're looking at that, and yet the way this is being responded to could not be more different. Europe and the EU are all rapidly backpedaling on these things and closing down these clinics and things of that sort. Whereas in the U.S., we're going, full steam ahead. I reviewed I guess it was an email that was sent by the representative of the ASPS to the author of the article in the City Journal. And you can tell the ASPS is being very cautious. They're trying to put out a reasonable, what I would call, they're discussing what I call evidence-informed medicine, which is you don't, go full steam ahead on some new treatment or surgery until you've seen good evidence to support the safety and effectiveness. And I think the ASPS is to be congratulated for doing that. I think in that way also, they don't unnecessarily turn up the heat or invite a strong negative reaction. I would love to have seen a complete renunciation. Personally, I am against gender-affirming care in minors, and I have no problem with saying that. But I think that the ASPS has a responsibility to look at things and investigate and discuss, and I think that's what they're doing. So the fact that they are the first major medical organization to do this, I'm very proud to be a member of the ASPS, I have to say. And I only hope that when the evidence is thoroughly reviewed, they will come out with a stronger statement that will basically take this one step further to say we need to stop doing these things until we have a better idea of exactly what the consequences are, not just short term, but long term. I think that the evidence is that we don't have much data at all. I reviewed an article on the numbers. This is just what they call, again, top surgery, removing healthy breasts in young women to turn them into boys. I was shocked at the number of operations done. It was something like over 5,000 over a period of a couple of years. I'm thinking, my God, that's 5,000 young women whose breasts have been cut off. And they talked about a regret rate of like 2%, and that was based on how many come back to have the surgery undone. And to me, that's a terrible measure of regret, because you can't just undo it with a simple operation. It requires extensive reconstruction, which many people are going to be unwilling or unable to go through. And it speaks nothing to the mindset of these individuals after having done this. So there's a lot of stuff being done, and I think that the fact that the ASPS is, as I said, pumping the brakes a bit is a wonderful thing, and I'm hoping that this will, encourage a little bit of courageous reevaluation by other organizations to start saying, yeah, we need to back off a little bit and look at this evidence more closely.
And it's so sad how many people have become experiments in real time, because that 2% rate is just among people who have, done that so far, who have had the ability and time, and their minds have changed so far. But these are going to need long-term studies with real longevity before we know how they really affected patients.
And the consequences are so dire. I mean, to talk about a permanently crippled individual that can never restore what they lost. How many of those do you have to have before you say, hey, we better have really, really strong evidence that we are doing the right thing here? Everything I've read, and I'm not claiming to be some expert, but everything I've read about this, and I've done a fair amount because of my situation, says that the vast majority of minors that profess to be transgender, if you don't proceed to all these processes, to transition them, 80 to 90% of them will settle into their birth sex very comfortably over time. And so how many people are you treating needlessly, irreversibly, when it comes to surgery, just to manage those few?
So true. Dr. Bosshardt, Senior Fellow at Do No Harm, thank you so much for your time today.
Well, thank you for having me on. I appreciate that. I hope it's been helpful.
Well, that does it for us on today's edition of Undercurrents. Make sure to subscribe here. Make sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts to the channel. And then for premium content, over at undercurrents.tv. As always, we will be back here with more on Tuesday and Thursday. I'm going to the DNC next week, and we'll be on the ground covering all the action, expecting some protests. We'll see if they pan out. But all of the major Democratic figures in the United States are speaking. Barack Obama, Pete Buttigieg, of course, President Biden, and Vice President Kamala Harris, Tim Walz. So we will be there. We will be covering it. Stay tuned for that.